This video contains the conclusion of my commentary on Alasdair MacIntyre's Ethics in the Conflicts of Modernity. And in this work, he describes a form of neo-Aristotelian philosophy that he recommends as the appropriate moral response to the compartmentalization and moral incoherence and fragmentation of our modern period. Another philosopher who responded to this fragmentation, crisis of authority within moral philosophy was Bernard Williams. I should have had this ready, but my shelf is right here. And a cursory inspection of the covers of these two books reveals that MacIntyre may have considered this book of his as which is 2016, as a rival and as a potential replacement for this 1985 work by Bernard Williams. You can kind of see a bit of a similarity there, and that's probably not a coincidence. So MacIntyre's response to Bernard Williams is going to be an important aspect of his theory as it's presented in this work. So we start today with the final three sections of Chapter 4. Chapter 4 had contained his final cumulative presentation of Thomistic Aristotelianism, and now in section 11 he responds to Bernard Williams' critique of Aristotelian and Thomistic concepts and arguments that he had originally sketched out previously in Chapter 3, at the end of Chapter 3. So he'd laid out Williams' critique of Aristotle's ethics at the end of Chapter 3, and now at the end of Chapter 4, following his account of the structure of practical rationality and justification in his version of Aristotelianism, he's prepared to give his response to Williams. He begins with Williams's charge that Aristotle lacks an adequate account of moral and political error. MacIntyre thinks that there are two different ways of characterizing the various types of practical error. We can identify them in sociological and psychological terms, or we can identify them as due to the lack of the relevant virtues. So, of course, we might consider, for example, let's say racism as a sociological phenomenon, as a social disease, so to speak, or as a psychological disorder. Or we could identify it as the lack of a sense of justice, for example, lack of the virtue of justice. So we can identify these moral and political errors in sociological or psychological terms, or as due to the lack of relevant virtues. Now, these are not rival, let alone incompatible ways of identifying them, since Aristotle's account of the virtues presupposes a psychology and a sociology. Political societies are classified according to how well they educate their members in the virtues. Likewise, the social relationships that allow this education to take place are either sustained or undermined by the exercise of the virtues. So, take an obvious example of such a social relationship, the family, which allows the education of children into the virtues to take place, is sustained by various virtues such as fidelity, for example, to one's spouse, generosity, justice within the family, and so forth. And if those virtues are lacking in the adults in the family, then the family has a tendency to break up and the children to not necessarily be educated in the virtues in the way they otherwise would have been. Hence, the source of moral and political error may be identified either in the agent, her or himself, or in his or her social relationships. So the problem is either it was a bad marriage, it was a toxic marriage, as we say nowadays, or we could say the problem was that the parents were jerks who treated each other poorly because they had these character defects that we can point to and so forth. They were selfish or whatever it might be. So what is it to be guilty of a moral or political error? MacIntyre responds on page 221 that it is to act from a desire for some object that the agent has no good reason to desire, unquote. To act from a desire for some object that an agent has no good reason for to desire. And so, again, we can go back to our broken home, our broken family, and say, well, one of the spouses had an affair. He acted for an object, namely the mistress, that he had no reason to desire. No good reason to desire. He had a reason, of course, but he had no good reason to desire. The reason was not sufficient to override the reasons he had for staying with his wife and family, we suppose, in this hypothetical. So how does this pertain to William's problem with Aristotle? William's problem wasn't that he didn't think that we have any conception of what it is for a household or political society to function well. We don't have any conception of what it is for a household or political society to function well. At least none that can be put to good use. None that can be put to use in a way that would tell us, what moral and political error are. So, and here we get the idea of, non-traditional households, non-traditional families, et cetera, and who's to say that, a single mother can't do just as good a job of inculcating the virtues in her child as she could if she was in a family, and so forth. So, of course, this is the issue. Like, what are we to say about these social relationships, supposedly? Williams would ask, how do we decide from which standpoint we are to judge that a political society is functioning well? There are many alternative standpoints, and Williams did think that Aristotle provided a way to decide between them. In particular, there's no scientific way to decide in the modern sense of science. Of course, people will appeal to empirical sociology or psychology and say, hey, look, the children, for example, you see this all the time as a debate sometimes, that the children of two same-sex spouses in a same-sex marriage, do they fare well or not as well as those in a traditional marriage? It's the children of a traditional marriage. And so, can we establish this? Williams would say we need a genuinely empirical sociology or psychology. Such an empirical social science could give us conclusions about the good life for human beings. But as it stands, we lack this. And we see, of course, the influence of, for example, political orientation on how these studies are conducted and how they are promulgated. There are many well-worked-out conceptions for Williams of what it is to live well, and no grounds for preferring one over the others. So this is a kind of radical, relativism in a way about the possibility of setting up any kind of standard for what the human good life is. We would need some kind of human science that was a genuine science in the way that physics or biology are. We don't have that, and so we can't really establish objectively what the good life for human beings is. That's the point, and that's because we can't really say what it is to be a person who errs in one's moral choices or political choices. We just lack that kind of standard. So MacIntyre is going to resist this and push back against it. MacIntyre's response to Williams is to ease him into an Aristotelian account by getting him to admit to the core propositions gradually. So the first thing he would do, he says, if he's having an imaginary conversation with the late Bernard Williams, would be to identify a set of hard-to-deny goods that are shared cross-culturally. Identify a set of hard-to-deny goods that are shared cross-culturally. And I'm going to resist the urge to list these on the whiteboard here because I don't want to give the impression, which I think would be sort of a false impression, that MacIntyre is ticking off here some kind of a script or a method that you could use to convince your relativist uncle that these are the, you should be a neo-Aristotelian. I don't think it is best thought of that way, so I'm not going to list these, but hopefully we can keep track of them. So on page 222, he says, that these are eightfold, so we can enumerate the set of goods whose contribution to the good life, whatever one's culture or social order, it would be difficult to deny. So this is the list of hard to deny goods that are shared cross-culturally. And so he lists things like health. Everybody likes health, right? A good standard of living, that provides you with food, clothing, and shelter and frees you from destitution. Good family relationships. Sufficient education to make good use of opportunities to develop one's powers. Work that is productive and rewarding. Good friends. Activities, athletic activities, aesthetic activities, intellectual activities, and the ability of a rational agent to order one's life and to identify and learn from one's mistakes. In other words, a kind of practical wisdom, phronesis. So those are the 8 things. We've got the health, standard of living, family relationships, sufficient education, work that's productive and rewarding, good friends, activities, and what I would call practical wisdom. These point to a general form or shape that a good human life will take. With admitted variability within these, MacIntyre is not saying that these are all necessary conditions to have a good life. One could lack one or the other. Of course, there are differences in temperament, and there might be a person who's happiest when they're alone and they don't want friends, and so they don't have friends, so they lack that aspect of it, or activities. But generally speaking, as a general rule, across cultures, most people are going to agree that there is a role for these 8 goods within a good life. So this is something shared cross-culturally, MacIntyre thinks. So that would be the first thing that we would do if we were trying to convince Williams to abandon, set aside his relativism. Second, MacIntyre thinks we should be able to show that overcoming adversity is an inescapable aspect of human life. Every human being who lives, a reasonable span of years is going to face adversity and have to overcome adversity, whether it's loss of health, money, loss of a job, friends, identity crisis, whatever it might be. There's going to be adversity, and you need to overcome this adversity. And this requires 3 things. Overcoming adversity requires the ability to make good choices between goods, rank ordering them. The ability to make good choices between goods. So, for example, you lose your job, money is tight, you're going to have to make choices. And you're going to have to be able to figure out, all right, so what am I going to give up? What things are important, what things are not important? Can I give up my, membership at the country club? Or should I send off one of my children to be raised by a foster family, right? So let me just take an obvious example. So that's the first thing, ability to make good choices between goods. Second is certain virtues. It is the virtues that are going to enable you to overcome adversity. And here, again, we have this sort of first virtue, as we saw in Aristotle, the first virtue of courage, of bravery, being essential often to overcome adversity. You can't just crawl into your closet, shut the door, and crawl into the fetal position and cry when you face adversity. You need courage. And of course, you can see easily the place of other virtues in overcoming adversity. Temperance, moderation, I can't be, spending a lot of money at the bar every night if I'm unemployed and so forth. So that requires temperance and so on. And so that's so ability to make good choices between goods are required in responding to adversity. Certain virtues are required in responding to adversity. And third, the ability to limit the importance that external goods have in our lives. Pleasure, money, and power. So the unbridled pursuit of pleasure, money, and power, if it really is truly unbridled, is always going to lead to grief. It's always going to lead to a degree of adversity. At some point, it's going to lead to a degree of adversity that is going to make one's life problematic, put it that way. So if you can never have enough pleasure, if you can never have enough money, if you can never have enough power, you might be able to cruise along contentedly for a while, but eventually you're going to find yourself in a train wreck. So the second stage then is to convince Williams of the need for these three things: the ability to make good choices between goods and rank order them, certain virtues, and the ability to limit the importance of external goods. So we've got a sense now that there are these goods that are common to all human beings cross-culturally. We've got a sense now that the virtues are important for human beings qua human. For these reasons, we need them to respond to adversity and to be able to rank order our goods and to rein ourselves in from perhaps a natural tendency that some people might have for unbridled pursuit of external goods. But even so, Williams will point to the fact, as MacIntyre imagines, Williams is going to point to the fact that there are still disagreements about the relative importance of goods, even for those who accept the first two stages. And MacIntyre at this point will note that such disagreements about the relative importance of goods, like the obvious one, family versus work, right? For example, such disagreements can only be resolved if the parties involved can deliberate with one another over how to resolve them, to order goods. Of course, yes, if you and I just retreat to our corner with our initial ranking of goods and you're over there saying, I'm prepared to sacrifice family life for the sake of advancing as far as I can in my career, and I'm over here saying, no, I'm prepared to, accept a kind of ceiling or plateau in my career if that means I can spend more time with my family. And if we just say we just agree to disagree and that's the end of the conversation, then yes, we will end up with Williams' kind of relativism about rank orderings of good. But this doesn't have to be the end of the story, of course. And if you and I are spouses and we have to, figure this out, we have to deliberate together about this. And so MacIntyre points out that here's the limitations of Williams' insistence on the first personal perspective we talked about last time. Because such disagreements can only be resolved if the parties will deliberate with one another over how to resolve them. And this is possible only if there's a certain kind of commonality between the parties, only if there's a meaningful amount of underlying agreement, which means the parties share a common mind. So at this point, what we really need is a certain kind of community. Now, for Aristotle, this community is the polis, ultimately. Ultimately, it's the polis. The polis is the unity in which deliberations about common goods occurs. Not the family, but the polis. And of course, we've already seen arguments that MacIntyre gave for why the good of the family typically is going to be dependent at least upon the good of the school and the good of the work setting, the workplace. So that leads us to a kind of broader community, the polis. So the third stage in MacIntyre's approach to Williams would be to rewrite Aristotle's argument about the need for the polis in contemporary terms. So what is the polis in the modern world? How do we translate Aristotle's notion that the polis is the proper human habitat in which deliberation and mutual rational cooperation for achieving the final end of the human being can occur? How do we translate that idea, since we no longer have Athenian city-states, into the modern period, the modern social and cultural and political structure? And so to do this, we first need to confront Williams' skepticism about Aristotle's definition of man as the rational animal. So I think what MacIntyre has in mind here is that if you accept Williams' idea that we're basically emotional, irrational creatures, or at least we're as essentially emotional, irrational creatures as we are rational, then the idea of recreating the polis is bound to seem implausible. One's bound to be pessimistic about that. For MacIntyre, what distinguishes us is our language-enabled ability to pose and answer questions about what is the good of doing such and such. This, for him, is linked to the ability to state the reasons for and against some proposal, which can then be evaluated. Williams' suggestion that falling helplessly in love is as distinctively human as being rational If you remember that from our discussion in Chapter 3, falling helplessly in love is as good a claim for being the essential human quality as being rational. That was Williams's proposal against Aristotle. MacIntyre says, well, this may be right, but it's not fundamental enough. It's not basic enough. The thing that makes it distinctively human to fall helplessly in love is in part that we can rationally evaluate whether or not it is a good thing to fall helplessly in love in this circumstance. So if you imagine people that just go crazy and fall helplessly in love and they can't reflect about whether this is a good thing or control themselves, that's not distinctively human. Right? That's like being a crazed wild animal or something like that. And so MacIntyre's point is that more fundamental in this capacity is what makes it distinctively human, which is our ability to reflect. And of course, if you're falling helplessly in love and you can reflectively endorse that, then that's one thing. But just falling helplessly in love without that rational reflection is not necessarily distinctively human. Now, these rational capacities we have, MacIntyre argues, are as distinctive of humans as playing in the ocean is distinctive of dolphins. So there can be seen to be, after all, a teleology in human life. I want to read a rather extended passage here on page 227, which contains some important ideas connected to this idea of the teleology of human life and MacIntyre's crucial concept of a final end, which is later related to his idea of a final good for human beings. So the final end and the final good for human beings. He says here at 227, as with non-human animals, so it is too with human agents. We observe the ends to which characteristically and generally their activities are directed. We note how with them too disease and injury prevent them from attaining their ends. We also note, still as external observers, two important differences from non-human animals: the length of time after weaning during which their young remain dependent on their parents and other elders, and the amount and kind of education that they have to receive from those parents and other elders if they are to function well as adults. Without that education, or if they have been badly educated, they will be unable to achieve their ends, since as agents they will not know how to rank order goods correctly and to identify their final end. But at this point, we are inescapably aware that they, these human beings, are we. They are we. That as agents, we are engaged, if we have been rightly educated, whether by ourselves or by others, in discovering what our end is. We are engaged in discovering what our end is, if we've been rightly educated. So that in our practice, we may be directed toward its attainment. For, on Aristotle's view, human agents as participants in the form of life that is distinctively human have a final end. And what it is a matter of fact. Human beings have a final end that's distinctively human, and what it is a matter of fact. They can only be understood, they can only understand themselves teleologically. There has to be teleology in human life because if we are properly educated, we are engaged in directing ourselves toward our final end. This idea of teleology entails the idea that there's something that it is best for me to be qua human being. We ask ourselves, we reflect, what should I be, what should I become if I want to be successful in life, if I want to be a good human being. And this idea follows from MacIntyre from our reflection on the way in which we view the various roles that we occupy in the course of our lives. So everyone admits that there's a telos or an end that's sought by a human being qua mother or qua teacher or qua farmer. So the good of a mother, of course, is uncontroversial. There is an end directedness. There's a directedness to occupying the role of mother, such that we can say uncontroversially, that person's a bad mother, that person's a good mother. Of course, there are borderline cases, but I'm just saying that it is possible without any controversy and without any significant disagreement to identify certain individuals as bad mothers and others uncontroversially as good mothers. And similarly with teachers or with farmers And I don't even need to spell out what those ends are that define those roles. And so Aristotle also observed this. You'll remember in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and he says, well, if these craftsmen have roles, qua craftsmen, will the human being have no role? MacIntyre says that this question arises because the human being will need to integrate these various roles in his or her life. And to do so will require a conception of what their good is, qua human being, not merely qua some specific role or other. They'll need to know what their good is qua human being, not just qua mother, teacher, or farmer. The only alternatives are to live either compartmentalized or haphazard lives. In order to answer the question of what is good for me qua human being, I need a conception of a final end or final good. So how am I to discern what this final good will be? MacIntyre follows Aquinas here. The final good will have to be a good that satisfies three conditions. So, note these. First, it cannot be a means to something else. The final good would have to be a good that is the final good. It can't be a means to some further good, because then that thing would be the final good. So that's kind of an obvious point. It cannot be the means to something else. Second, it cannot be a particular good on the same order as other particular goods. It cannot be a particular good on the same order as other goods. Why not? Well, because then it would just be one good among others. And if that were the case, it couldn't provide the measure of the good of our lives. Because there would be other things that were good, and maybe they were less important. But the mere fact that these other good things are less important wouldn't necessarily mean that the one thing that we seek primarily and first of all could explain to us or could tell us why these other things are less important. And that's what's needed. So it cannot be a particular good on the same order as other particular goods, because then it would just be one good among others and couldn't provide the measure for the good of our lives. And third, it cannot compete with other goods. It cannot compete with other goods because the various other intrinsic goods are also valued for their own sake, and they have their rightful place in our lives. So the final good can't compete with other goods. Now for MacIntyre, this leaves only one thing for the final good to be, and that is our lives as wholes. The final good can only be our life as a whole, as a unity. And this is why our lives need to have a narrative structure. It's the narrative structure of our lives that constitutes them as wholes and unities, and thereby enables them to serve as our final end. That's a very important point for MacIntyre's ethical theory, so I'll say it once again. It's the narrative structure of our lives, that constitutes them as wholes and unities, and thereby enables them to serve as our final end. The view that our true final end, our true final good, is our lives as a whole, has the paradoxical sounding consequence that the good life is necessarily one that is incomplete. MacIntyre explains this on page 231. It may seem paradoxical, but is not, to express that insight by saying that on Aquinas' view, we complete and perfect our lives by allowing them to remain incomplete. That's the paradoxical sounding statement. We complete and perfect our lives by allowing them to remain incomplete. A good life is one in which an agent, although continuing to rank order particular and finite goods, treats none of these goods as necessary for the completion of his or her life, so leaving her or himself open to a final good beyond all such goods, as good desirable beyond all such goods. A good, I think that's a typo, a good desirable beyond all such goods. Defective lives are those in which agents either mistakenly identify some particular finite good that they have achieved or will achieve as their final good, or suppose that failure or defeat in achieving such a good is a failure to achieve their final good. Does one have to be a theist to understand one's lives in these terms? Of course not. Whether Aquinas is right about the presuppositions of such a life is one thing. What the character of such a life is quite another. Note that on this view, lives cut short by inopportune and untimely deaths are not thereby imperfect. What matters is what the agent was open to at the time of his or her death. Not the perhaps great but finite goods of which the agent was deprived by that death. So this is an idea that it necessarily remains a bit obscure, and MacIntyre is going to fill it in with these narratives, these four narratives that he's going to give in the next chapter that make sense of what this idea of a complete incompletion is, which does sound to be sort of a contradiction in terms, of course. But the idea is that one directs one's life towards some final good, some great good like justice, and towards the cultivation of virtues that are going to enable one to overcome obstacles and pursue that good. And even if that good is not finally achieved, and if it's such that it can never be finally achieved, one's life could be viewed as having a kind of completion insofar as it has this unity of being directed towards that thing. So we return here, I think, to this distinctively Aristotelian idea that we saw in the Nicomachean Ethics of the target, the necessity of the target. The target is what we aim at. Now, for Aquinas, this is going to be God or the beatific vision or the state of blessedness or something like that. But MacIntyre is saying that that's not necessary in order for this conception of what makes the good life good, what serves as the final good of the good life, a cogent notion. So MacIntyre's view is ultimately a secular view. It's compatible with the secular outlook as well as with a theistic outlook. In concluding his reply to Williams, MacIntyre admits that he would not expect someone sympathetic to Williams's frame of mind to find his reply convincing. But that's a mark, he says, rather, of how systematic the disagreements are between Thomistic Aristotelianism and Williams's presupposition. So at the end of the day, yes, you still have to choose between which way you're going to go, because there are, I think even MacIntyre admits, still fundamental differences in starting points. But I think, in a way, MacIntyre may be being somewhat modest here, because I think in recounting the commonality in conceptions cross-culturally of various goods and the necessity of the virtues for overcoming the inevitable adversity in human life, and the commonality between human beings and other biological organisms and having a kind of end-directedness. One could say that MacIntyre has actually gone quite a ways to putting someone who insists nonetheless on rejecting all of that in a kind of uncomfortable position, intellectually speaking, theoretically speaking. And so, of course, everyone has to decide for themselves to what extent this is an adequate rejoinder to the concerns that Williams had expressed about Aristotelian ethics. Finally, MacIntyre addresses three objections. Finally, in this chapter, he addresses three objections to the role that narrative plays in ethics on his theory. And the first objection is from Jean-Paul Sartre in his novel Nausea. This is the bottom of page 232. Sartre held that the narrative structures of the story itself falsifies. There are no true stories, says Antoine Roquentin, the character who is Sartre's mouthpiece in La Nausea. Living is one thing, telling stories is another. Living is one thing, telling stories is another. When we tell a story, we begin as we do because we already have in mind the ending, the outcome. In life, we never know the outcome in advance. And so there are no such endings and no such beginnings. Things just happen. Hence Sartre's conclusion that there are no plots, no true stories. So there are no stories because a story is something that an author writes when they have in mind how it's going to end. And life isn't like that. We don't know what the ending is. So we can't have narrations of our lives. This makes no sense. That's Jean-Paul Sartre's, the great existentialist philosopher's criticism. Now, Sartre's criticism makes sense for MacIntyre only if we believe, as Sartre did, that there is no final end that can represent the completion of a human life. MacIntyre admits, of course, that agents never know in advance the outcomes of their choices. However, what they do know is what it would be for the outcomes of their choices to turn out well or badly. And in knowing this, I'm quoting him now here, in knowing this, they have some sense of an ending, and they are enacting a narrative, unquote. So I'm enacting a narrative, I'm sort of, as it were, fantasizing about how this is going to end. And so from the practical perspective that MacIntyre is concerned with, I am narrating my life and projecting an anticipated ending. Of course, it may not turn out that way, right? This is certainly is a narrative that's constantly being rewritten. But it's one thing to say it's a narrative that's constantly being rewritten as one goes through the course of one's life, and another thing to say that there's no narrative at all, or there couldn't be. There can be a narrative, one that is a kind of projecting of how you hope things are going to end, and that's what makes your life intelligible at that moment. But of course, if it doesn't end that way, you may have to make adjustments later on. I think that's what MacIntyre is saying here. MacIntyre also thinks that education in the virtues gives directedness to life. And here, I think we see a bit of what in Aristotle's time was a kind of proto-Stoic insistence that we saw in Aristotle at the end of Book 1, that a life where you are committed to the virtues and into that kind of ethical integrity is less vulnerable to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune than a life that isn't unified by a kind of sustained, persistent commitment to develop and exercise the virtues. A properly educated moral agent seeks to persist in the maintenance, development, and exercise of the virtues throughout the course of their life. And so that by itself gives a kind of directedness to life, regardless of whether your projects go astray or not. You know, your projects go astray, but at least you have control over whether you behave courageously under those circumstances. And this is another thing that we'll see illustrated in MacIntyre's narratives that he includes at the end of the book. Thus, it's a non-coincidental feature of Sartre's protagonist Antoine Roquentin in Nausea that he is, on MacIntyre's reading, quote, a splendid example of an intelligent agent who has never been educated into the virtues and so fails to understand his own life, unquote. So a bit of a dig there against Sartre. The problem with Roquentin was not that life can't be given a unified narrative structure. The problem with Roquentin was that he lacked the virtues and therefore lacked the kind of directedness that the virtues can give to a life. And so he ended up believing that living is one thing, telling stories is another, which was a mistake from MacIntyre's perspective. That's a mistake. Okay. Two other objections, which are considered in the next section, entitled Continuing Disagreements Concerning Narratives. This is the final section of Chapter 4. The two other objections to the role that MacIntyre assigns narrative in his ethical theory come one each from the continental and analytic traditions of philosophy. The first comes from Laszlo Tengelyi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Tengelyi. He argues, following Lévi-Strauss and Merleau-Ponty, that there's something called the wild. And this is described in a quotation from the MacIntyre. Actually, it's not a quotation. It's just MacIntyre's description on the top of 239. Tengelyi follows Merleau-Ponty in speaking of what he calls the wild as that in our lived experience without which we could not live and think as we do, without which our lives would lack the meanings and forms they have, but which itself remains beyond all culturally determinate forms. So some kind of beyond, this is, sort of like the idea of being as such in Heidegger. There's some source of intelligibility that is beyond our little worlds. And that when we try to control and systematize and organize our little worlds, inevitably this beyond is going to break in at various points and disrupt our neat little orderly world that we've constructed for ourselves. Because what makes our orderly world possible is something that's beyond them, that we cannot completely control or completely grasp ever. So this wild emerges in the course of our lived experiences in moments in which something radically new begins that does not fit into the ongoing stories that we tell ourselves about our lives. Thus, from this perspective, imposing a narrative on one's life is to falsify it, because it sweeps these experiences of the wild under the rug and thereby imposes a false coherence on one's life. So that's the objection from Tingelyi. MacIntyre's response to this objection is pretty simple and straightforward. It's to allege that we can, in fact, incorporate these experiences of radical newness and wildness into the narrative. Quote, we can acknowledge the incoherence and unintelligibility of this or that aspect of our lives in a coherent and intelligible narrative, unquote. So there can be a place for unintelligible or incoherent aspects of one's life within the overall coherent and intelligible narrative. That's the point. So the point is that for Tingelyi's objections based on the wild to really have any punch, he would have to say that there can be no coherent, intelligent narrative at all. It's not enough to say just that, there are these lived experiences that we can't really make sense of, that we can't fit into the overall narrative that we're telling ourselves of the unity of our lives. So that's from the continental side of philosophy, the phenomenological tradition. From the analytic side of philosophy, Galen Strawson objects that experiencing or conceiving of one's life as a narrative is not an especially good thing. He suggests that, for some at least, life is better experienced in an episodic way that doesn't add up to a coherent narrative. These people live a happy-go-lucky, see what comes along existence, and what's wrong with that? Sort of like I think of this as like the Seinfeld objection, right? The sitcom about nothing. Every episode kind of disjointed. There's no story arc and so forth, development of the characters or anything like that. And maybe this mode of life is actually better and happier, Galen Strawson says. Just living from episode to episode of your life, seeing what comes along next and not constructing any narrative. MacIntyre's response to this is first noting that at crucial junctions in every human life, it's inevitable that anyone with a modicum of practical intelligence will seek orientation by recounting how their life has gone so far. Right? So something happens to you, say divorce, and you say, well, how did I get to this point? How did I get to this point where my marriage went so bad? Or you find yourself stalled at work and advancing your career, and you question, how did I get to this point? And inevitably at that moment, to answer that question, how did I get to this point, we're going to tell ourselves something about what happened. We're going to reflect what happened in my life. How did my story develop to this point? We're going to tell a narrative. But more to the point, and again, here's MacIntyre's sort of dig at Strawson, he notes that to defend the superiority of the episodic happy-go-lucky life, Strawson would have to recount it narratively. For even an episodic life will have its history. One problem with such people, these happy-go-lucky people, is that their happy-go-lucky life is usually made possible on the backs of others who make it possible. You think here, of course, of someone who has disposable income, and so the labor of others is enabling them to live in this kind of carefree way because they have lots of money. They always, if they a problem arises, they don't need to hold down a steady job. They've got a trust fund or whatever. So there's a question that arises here. Well, how would Strawson justify such a life to others? So that's MacIntyre's response to this suggestion from Strawson. Chapter 5, 4 narratives. And we're going to be giving only an abridged, abbreviated version of this chapter. In the introductory section, MacIntyre begins his final chapter with a summary of the four-part thesis from the preceding argument. He says, agents only do well if and when they act to satisfy those desires that they have good reason to desire. That's the first part of his thesis. Agents only do well if and when they act to satisfy those objects they have good reason to desire. Second, only agents who are sound and effective practical reasoners act this way. Only agents who are sound and effective practical reasoners act this way, namely to satisfy objects that they have good reason to desire. I'm not saying this quite right. Yeah, I missed part of it. Agents only do well if and when they act on those, so as to satisfy those desires whose objects they have good reason to desire. Typical complex MacIntyrean syntax here. Agents only do well if and when they act so as to satisfy those desires for those objects that they have good reason to desire. I missed the act so as to satisfy those desires. I missed the desires there. Only agents who are sound and effective practical reasoners act in this way so as to satisfy those desires whose objects they have good reason to desire. Such agents must be disposed to act as the virtues require, and such agents will be directed in their actions toward the achievement of their final end. Now, MacIntyre recognizes that this thesis, this complex thesis, can seem like a platitude until it's spelled out. But it's not enough to merely spell it out in abstract conceptual terms. It can only be adequately understood if it can be seen to be applied to concrete real-world examples. MacIntyre concludes, therefore, by narrating the stories of four individuals who, according to him, exemplify the truth of his complex thesis. These are stories from the near past about four individuals who lead untypical lives, but whose choices throw light, MacIntyre thinks, on the everyday choices of modern life. It's MacIntyre's view that recounting such narratives of the lives of others helps us to understand the ethical life and apply lessons to our own lives. Thus, the bulk of the concluding chapter is taking up recounting these lives, which is a kind of selective ethical biography, you might say, of some key moral choices and paths that they took along the road of their journey to their final end, and the place of the virtues in their lives. So the figures he covers are the Soviet journalist and writer Vasily Grossman, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, first female U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian historian and journalist, and Dennis Fall, the Irish Catholic priest and civil rights advocate. Now, there's no point to my summarizing these here, since the whole point of them is to provide portraits of virtuous lives in all of their fine-grained detail. So I will skip at this point simply to the end of the book. You might want to pause the video at this point and read these narratives. So, the final section. So what? Following these four narratives, MacIntyre observes that these were examples of four lives that went well. They could also have gone badly because of misdirected desires or faulty practical reasoning, had that been the case in these lives. Crucial to all of them was their identification of their goals and the obstacles to achieving them. One thing all four cases shared in common was the identification of some of these obstacles as wrongs or evils to be confronted as wrongs and evils. Typically, these were various forms of prejudice and discrimination. These individuals viewed the barriers that were set up against them not merely as obstacles to find their way around with as little effort as possible, but as intolerable evils that needed to be erased, not merely for their own sake, but for the sake of others as well. For MacIntyre, this suggests that their desire to achieve their own good had the right character, because their own good and the common good were linked. Through this widening of desire, the agent's original narrow good the good of achieving their own goals in the face of an obstacle, now becomes the desire to remove the obstacle for all, and thus their desires are significantly widened. But this also creates for practical reasoning the task of considering how to balance their actions in furtherance of their own goal with actions in furtherance of their new commitment to eliminating this general evil. These 4 lives, MacIntyre thinks, are instructive about how to live well, because certain shared qualities that they exemplify, despite their differences. They all exemplified the virtues of dependability, truthfulness, and imagination. All 4 developed a care for common goods and a capacity for friendship, which enabled them to deliberate jointly with others about the particular goods that were at stake in their particular situation. All 4 were also notable for having a variety of good friends from different walks of life. A fully rational agent characteristically has a variety of good friends. To have good friends, one must be a good friend, and that requires integrity and constancy. Other virtues. Friends are ones who are best able to judge an agent's integrity and constancy, and thereby the overall directedness or lack thereof in an agent's life. There are 2 aspects to this overall directedness. First, quote, a pattern of development in the ordering of goods on particular occasions so that some goods have overriding importance, unquote. Typically, this will be some good or goods that cannot be achieved by achieving this or that on some particular occasion. It means that all these lives will remain incomplete, or did remain incomplete. Second, there's a story to be told, I'm quoting again, story to be told about how their desires and their reasons for desiring what they desire became whatever they are now. The changes in their desire, and so in themselves, had an overall direction. MacIntyre concludes, directedness of these 2 kinds is then a mark of lives lived well. A life in which there's a pattern of development in the ordering of goods on particular occasions, and one in which there's a story to be told about how their desires developed into whatever they are now. So that the changes in their desires have an overall direction, as does their ordering of particular goods. So there's a directedness in the process of their moral development, their moral deliberation. They're arriving at a kind of sort of greater illumination and insight into what it is their life has been about. Lives lived well are directed towards some set of attainable goods, a set, however, that changes as a person moves through life. Yet MacIntyre noted that all 4 lives were incomplete because they were directed toward goods that cannot be achieved on this or that occasion. And this might suggest that such lives are failures, which is, of course, the opposite of what MacIntyre intends and says. There is no particular finite good that perfects and completes one's life. The structure of human existence is such that there is always something more to be attained. A life is perfect and complete when an agent persistently makes progress toward the best good that she knows. Is there some ultimate good beyond all these finite goods? That's a theological, not an ethical question. MacIntyre suggests in conclusion that maybe at this point ethics borders on theology. And that's the book. So thank you for watching these videos and for considering the discussion questions. I look forward to future interaction, perhaps with you.